You can't let a young'un decide for himself. He'll grab at the first flashy thing with shiny ribbons on it.
Andy Griffith spent his life teaching America how to be calm, kind, and steady. But the truth is, his own world was quietly falling apart. Behind the gentle smile was a man carrying childhood trauma, broken marriages, a son's addiction, and losses that never healed. What happened inside his home was nothing like what viewers saw on screen, and while millions believed he lived a simple, happy life, the woman who loved him first was fading in silence, as Andy himself slowly unraveled. Eventually, Andy and his wife would each face devastating tragic endings marked by illness, loss, and a final chapter no one saw coming. A childhood marked by struggles. Andy Samuel Griffith was one of the most recognizable faces in American television history. For millions of viewers, he was the calm, wise, and endlessly patient Sheriff Andy Taylor, guiding his son through life in the quiet town of Mayberry. But behind that carefully crafted persona was a man shaped by poverty, humiliation, and emotional scars that followed him into adulthood. And while America saw a wholesome legend, his private world was marked by inner battles, strained relationships, and a marriage to the love of his life that slowly unraveled under the weight of personal tragedy. Andy Griffith was born on June 1, 1926, in Mount Airy, North Carolina, to Carl Lee Griffith and Geneva Nunn Griffith. His family struggled financially, especially during the Great Depression. They lived in a small house without a bathroom, something Andy later spoke about openly. Money was tight, opportunities were limited, and comfort was a luxury they couldn't afford. School wasn't much easier. Andy was often bullied for being poor and socially awkward. Other kids mocked his clothes and his quiet nature. Those early years left a deep mark. He carried insecurity well into adulthood, and people close to him later described him as someone who could be warm and generous, but also guarded, sensitive, and quick-tempered when hurt. Music became his escape. From a young age, Andy showed a strong interest in performance. He learned to play guitar and developed a love for singing. At one point, he even considered becoming a Moravian minister before realizing his heart was really in music and entertainment. He attended Mount Airy High School, where he joined drama and music programs, finally finding a place where he fit in. After graduation, he enrolled at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, earning a Bachelor of Music degree in 1949. For a short time, Andy worked as a high school music and drama teacher in Goldsboro, North Carolina. But teaching wasn't the end goal. He wanted a stage. So, he started performing comedy monologues in churches and civic clubs. Everything changed in 1953 when Andy recorded a humorous monologue called "What It Was Football." It unexpectedly became a nationwide hit, selling over 800,000 copies. Almost overnight, he went from struggling performer to rising star. That success opened doors to theater. Andy began working in summer stock productions before landing his Broadway breakthrough in 1955 with No Time for Sergeants. His performance earned widespread praise and introduced him to Don Knotts, beginning a friendship that would last a lifetime. 2 years later, Andy shocked audiences with his dramatic role in A Face in the Crowd, directed by Elia Kazan. He played a charming drifter who rises to fame as a dangerous media figure. The film didn't do well initially, but it later became recognized as a classic, proving Andy wasn't just a comedian, he was a serious actor with range. But the biggest break of his entire life came from television, when The Andy Griffith Show premiered on CBS. Andy starred as Sheriff Andy Taylor, alongside Ron Howard as Opie and Don Knotts as Barney Fife. The show ran for 8 seasons and consistently ranked in the Nielsen Top 10. It became one of the most beloved series in American TV history. Viewers saw him as the ultimate father figure. But behind the scenes, Andy was still carrying the emotional weight of his childhood. His career was filled with honors. He was inducted into the Television Hall of Fame in 1991 and received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2005 from President George Bush. By all appearances, Andy Griffith had achieved everything. But what the public rarely saw was the deeply personal side of his life. Fame gave him everything he once lacked, but it also deepened the loneliness he carried from childhood. And at the center of that emotional world was Barbara, the woman who stood beside him before the spotlight arrived, shared his rise, and endured the parts of him the audience never saw. Their relationship began with hope. It ended in heartbreak. The love Andy never forgot. Before fame reshaped his life, before television turned him into America's favorite sheriff, Andy Griffith had already found a love that mattered deeply to him. Her name was Barbara Bray Edwards. Barbara was born in 1926 in North Carolina. She was a gifted singer with a warm, steady voice and a natural presence on stage. While she never reached the same level of fame as Andy, people who knew her remembered her musical talent and confidence. She performed in choirs and stage productions and was admired for her dedication to music. That shared love of music became the foundation of their relationship. Andy and Barbara met in the late 1940s while attending the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Andy was studying music, still unsure of where life would take him. Barbara was also involved in performing arts. They spent long hours around rehearsals, practice rooms, and campus performances. Friendship turned into something deeper, built on common dreams and creative energy. On August 22, 1949, shortly after Andy graduated, they got married. At that point, Andy wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. He was simply a young man trying to find his place in the world. Barbara stood beside him through those uncertain years, through his short teaching job, through his early comedy performances, and through the slow, uneven climb into entertainment. She believed in him before the audience ever did. When Andy began performing monologues in churches and civic clubs, Barbara was there. When he struggled financially, she helped keep life steady. When he started landing theater roles, she supported the long hours and travel. Friends later described her as grounding and patient, someone who gave Andy emotional balance when his confidence wavered. But then, everything changed. Andy's career took off, first with comedy records and Broadway, then with film, and finally with television. By 1960, he had become a household name through The Andy Griffith Show. Suddenly, their private life was no longer private. Fame gave him the security, recognition, and control he once lacked. But it also brought pressure. Andy's schedule became intense, long days on set, public appearances, endless demands. Barbara, who had once shared his creative world, now lived in its shadow. While Andy was celebrated everywhere he went, she struggled with the loss of normal life and the constant attention that came with being married to a television star. They adopted 2 children during this period. Their son, Andy Samuel Griffith Jr., known as Sam, was born in 1957. Later, they adopted a daughter, Dixie. From the outside, they looked like a perfect family. But inside their home, things were changing. Barbara began to feel overlooked, and Andy became more absorbed in work. The emotional distance grew quietly. Insiders noticed that the couple no longer shared the closeness they once had. They had history together, decades of memories, but they were slowly moving in different directions. Barbara struggled with the lack of privacy and the way Andy's fame reshaped their daily lives. Andy, still carrying emotional scars from childhood, often withdrew instead of opening up. By the late 1960s, Andy was at the peak of his career. Meanwhile, his marriage was under strain. What started as a partnership built on music and shared dreams had turned into two people living separate emotional lives. And in 1972, after over 23 years of marriage, Andy and Barbara divorced. The official reason was irreconcilable differences. Behind that simple phrase were years of growing apart, career pressure, personal incompatibility, and the erosion of intimacy. Soon after the divorce, Barbara stepped away from the spotlight, and Andy moved on. But those who knew him said Barbara always remained a part of his emotional history. And while Andy continued forward, building new relationships and reshaping his personal life, the foundation that Barbara helped create was gone. The boy from North Carolina who once leaned on her strength now faced a new chapter alone, carrying fame in one hand and unresolved loneliness in the other. But what came next would only deepen the complicated pattern of love, loss, and emotional isolation that followed him for the rest of his life. Andy's chaotic love life. After his marriage to Barbara ended, Andy Griffith did not settle into single life for long. The divorce had closed a chapter that began before fame ever arrived. And while Andy continued working and appearing steady in public, privately he was trying to rebuild something that had taken decades to form. He had spent most of his adult life inside marriage, first with Barbara, and now he found himself searching for connection again, hoping that a new relationship might bring the stability that had slipped away. Not long after, he met Solika Kasuto, a Greek actress whose career had mostly unfolded in her home country. Solika had a background in performing arts, but was not part of Hollywood's inner circle, and that distance from the American entertainment world seemed to appeal to Andy at the time. Details about their first meeting remain limited, but sources place it in the mid-1970s, when Andy was still adjusting emotionally to life after Barbara and navigating the uncertainty that followed the end of The Andy Griffith Show. They married in 1973, and from the outside, the relationship appeared quiet and uncomplicated. But underneath the surface, differences slowly began to appear. Andy remained deeply tied to his career, traveling frequently and staying mentally absorbed in projects, while Solika preferred privacy and a calmer life away from constant attention. Over time, that difference in lifestyle created distance, and despite their efforts, the connection faded. After about 6 years of marriage, Andy and Solika divorced in 1981, with irreconcilable differences listed as the reason. It was another relationship that ended without public drama, but left Andy once again facing emotional separation, reinforcing a growing pattern in his personal life. By this point, Andy had experienced the collapse of 2 marriages, and although his professional reputation remained strong, his private world continued to feel unsettled. Then came his third and final marriage. Andy met Cindy Knight while filming the television movie Murder in Coweta County, where he starred alongside Johnny Cash. Cindy was an actress born in 1953 who had appeared in several television projects during the early 1980s. Their connection formed quickly, despite the large age difference between them, with Cindy being 27 years younger than Andy. They married on April 12, 1983, and unlike his previous marriages, this one endured. They did not have children together, but Cindy became Andy's closest companion during the later stages of his life. As his career slowed and his health declined, she took on a central role in his daily routine, accompanying him to medical appointments, managing household matters, and staying beside him as his physical strength gradually faded. Insider reports later described Cindy as protective and deeply devoted, and their relationship provided Andy with a sense of steadiness that had been missing for years. Their marriage lasted nearly 3 decades, continuing until Andy's death in 2012. But even as Cindy became his anchor, Andy's romantic past never fully disappeared from public conversation. For years, rumors followed him about his relationship with Annetta Corso, who played Helen Crump on The Andy Griffith Show. On screen, their characters shared a romantic storyline, and off-screen, many fans and biographers believed the bond between Andy and Annetta went beyond professional friendship. Several people connected to the show later hinted at a closeness that felt deeper than typical co-stars, though nothing was ever officially confirmed. Those rumors added to the image of a personal life that was far more complicated than Andy's gentle television persona suggested. Over the years, he was also linked to brief relationships during his Hollywood career, though most were kept private and never documented in detail. What became clear, however, was that Andy struggled to maintain emotional continuity in his relationships, moving from one chapter to another while carrying unresolved feelings from the last. Each new relationship offered hope, but none fully erased the emotional wounds left behind by his first marriage. Because no matter how many relationships followed, Barbara remained the woman who knew him before fame changed everything. And as Andy grew older, the consequences of those early emotional fractures began to surface in ways no one expected, leading to a tragedy that would affect both him and Barbara deeply, long after their marriage was over. The tragedy that shook Andy. For all the laughter Andy Griffith brought into living rooms across America, his real life carried an intense heaviness that never fully lifted. One of the deepest wounds came from his role as a father. Andy and Barbara Bray Edwards were unable to have biological children. It was something they kept private, but it affected them deeply. Adoption became their way forward, a chance to build the family they both wanted. On television, Andy played one of the most beloved dads in American history. At home, he tried to be that same steady presence for his own children. But real life didn't follow a sitcom script. Their son, Sam, grew up mostly outside the spotlight. Unlike his famous father, he avoided Hollywood and eventually worked in real estate. He was often described as reserved, someone who didn't seek attention. But behind that quiet life, Sam was struggling. For years, he battled alcoholism and substance abuse. It was a long, painful fight that stretched across much of his adult life. Andy tried to help in private, keeping the family's troubles away from the public eye. He rarely spoke about it, choosing silence over sympathy. But in 1996, Sam died at just 38 years old. The loss devastated Andy. Although he never gave emotional interviews about it, insider reports noted that the grief changed him. He became more withdrawn, quieter. The pain of losing a child is something no parent ever truly recovers from. And Andy carried that loss for the rest of his life. To the public, he was still the calm, wise sheriff. However, privately, he was a father who had buried his son. Fame didn't protect him from that heartbreak. If anything, it made everything harder. But Andy's struggles didn't stop with family. Professionally, Andy also carried frustrations that followed him for decades. After The Andy Griffith Show ended in 1968, he faced something many television stars experience: typecasting. Audiences had grown so attached to Sheriff Andy Taylor that casting directors struggled to see him as anything else. Years earlier, he had proven his dramatic ability in A Face in the Crowd, playing a dangerous, manipulative media figure. Critics praised the performance, but the movie failed commercially. That box office disappointment limited his chances in serious film roles. So after Mayberry, Andy entered a quiet career lull. Offers slowed. Projects didn't land. For a while, he wasn't sure what came next. He also carried creative frustration from his earlier success. While he was the star of his show, his co-star Don Knotts often stole scenes with his sharp physical comedy. Andy respected Don deeply, but there were moments when he felt overshadowed, even on his own series. It wasn't until 1986 that he found lasting success again with Matlock, where he played defense attorney Ben Matlock. The role brought him back into the spotlight and introduced him to a new generation of viewers. But by then, Andy was older, carrying decades of emotional weight. By this stage of his life, he had lived through poverty, fame, divorce, addiction within his family, and the death of his son. He had built a public image based on kindness and wisdom. However, behind closed doors, he had endured loss after loss. And while Andy carried that burden quietly, Barbara was dealing with her own struggles after their divorce. Struggles that would eventually lead her down a difficult and tragic path of her own. And what happened to Barbara in her final years would add another layer of tragedy to a story already filled with loss. The tragic decline of Barbara Edwards. After her divorce from Andy Griffith in 1972, Barbara Bray Edwards chose a life far removed from attention, stepping quietly away from the world of entertainment and settling into a private existence that reflected who she had always been beneath the surface. She did not attempt to reconnect with Hollywood and did not seek any kind of public platform. Instead, Barbara focused on living quietly and maintaining her relationship with her children, Sam and Dixie, building a smaller life centered on routine, family, and personal peace. The marriage that once placed her beside one of television's biggest stars was now behind her, and she seemed content to let that chapter close without explanation or publicity. But even in that quieter life, Barbara carried emotional weight that never truly lifted. She had spent more than 2 decades supporting Andy during his rise, standing beside him when money was tight, encouraging his early performances, and helping him navigate the transition from struggling musician to national celebrity. That history didn't disappear just because the marriage ended. It stayed with her, woven into years of memories that couldn't simply be erased. At the same time, she was deeply concerned about her son Sam, who struggled with alcoholism and substance abuse. This battle placed enormous strain on both parents. Barbara remained close to him and tried to support him as best she could, carrying the fear that comes with watching a child suffer, while knowing there is only so much a parent can do. That kind of stress has a way of settling into the body. By the late 1970s, Barbara's health began to decline. She did not speak publicly about her condition, and very little information was ever released. Those close to her later said she dealt with illness quietly, choosing privacy over attention, just as she had done since leaving Andy's world behind. She withdrew further from social circles and entertainment connections, living increasingly out of view while focusing on her own well-being and her family. In 1980, she passed away at the age of 53. Her death came only 8 years after her divorce from Andy, and sources listed the cause as illness and natural causes, though details were never widely shared. Her passing was quiet, marked without fanfare, and reflected the way she had chosen to live since the marriage ended. Andy did not release emotional statements or speak openly about her death, but privately, those who knew him said he was deeply affected. Barbara had been part of his life long before fame arrived. She knew him when he was teaching music, when he was performing small comedy routines, and when he was still chasing opportunity instead of managing it. She had shared his earliest struggles, his first successes, and the long stretch of years that built his foundation. Losing her meant losing someone who understood him before the world ever formed an opinion. Her death added another layer to the emotional weight he already carried. Years later, friends would note how Andy held on to these losses quietly, absorbing them rather than expressing them, moving forward while keeping his grief private. The end of his first marriage had already left its mark, and Barbara's passing closed the door on that entire chapter permanently, leaving behind memories that could never be revisited. She represented his beginning, the young musician, the uncertain performer, the hopeful husband. When Barbara died, that version of Andy disappeared with her. What remained was a man shaped by decades of work, complicated relationships, and deeply personal loss, continuing through life while carrying memories that few people around him truly understood. And while Barbara's story ended there, Andy's did not. He still had years ahead of him, but the emotional toll was already evident. And as time moved forward, his own health would begin to fail, setting the stage for a final chapter that would mirror the tragic decline Barbara had already endured. Because the woman who once stood beside him at the very beginning was gone. And before long, Andy himself would begin to fade. The tragic end of Andy Griffith's life. By the time Andy Griffith reached his later years, the energy that once carried him across stages and television sets had slowly begun to fade, replaced by a fragile routine shaped by illness, age, and the intense weight of everything he had already endured. For decades, he had pushed forward through career pressures, broken relationships, and personal loss. But his body was now forcing him to slow down. Andy had struggled with heart problems for years. In 2000, doctors performed a quadruple heart bypass surgery, a major procedure that marked a turning point in his health. While he recovered and continued making appearances afterward, those close to him noticed that he was never quite the same. His stamina weakened, his movements became slower, and everyday tasks began to require more effort than before. Alongside his heart disease, Andy also lived with diabetes and hypertension, conditions that further complicated his health and placed constant strain on his body. Over time, walking became difficult, and he was often seen using assistants to move around. The strong, steady man audiences had grown up watching was now dealing with limitations he could no longer hide. As his health declined, Andy withdrew more and more from public life. He spent most of his final years at his coastal home on Roanoke Island, choosing quiet days over appearances, surrounded by familiar scenery rather than cameras and crowds. The home offered peace and distance from Hollywood, and it became his refuge as his world grew smaller. At his side during this period was Cindy Knight, his third wife and most enduring partner. Cindy became his caregiver, companion, and emotional anchor. She helped manage his daily routines, accompanied him to medical appointments, and stayed close as his strength continued to fade. Their marriage had lasted nearly 3 decades by this point, and she remained devoted to him through every stage of his decline. Andy rarely spoke publicly about how difficult those years were. He preferred privacy. Insiders said he lived quietly and somewhat reclusively, seeing fewer people and keeping his circle small. The laughter that once filled studios had been replaced by long afternoons at home, gentle walks when he could manage them, and moments of reflection shaped by memories stretching back to Mount Airy, Barbara, Mayberry, and the son he had lost. He had lived a long life, but it had not been an easy one. And on July 3, 2012, Andy Griffith passed away at the age of 86. He died in the morning hours at his home on Roanoke Island, surrounded by family. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, bringing an end to a life defined by both extraordinary success and deeply personal sorrow. News of his passing spread quickly. Fans across generations mourned the man who had brought warmth and wisdom into their homes for decades. Tributes poured in from fellow actors, public figures, and viewers who had grown up with his shows, many describing him as a symbol of kindness and calm in an often chaotic world. But Andy had made his wishes clear long before that day arrived. He did not want a public funeral. He did not want crowds. He did not want prolonged ceremonies. Within just 4 to 5 hours of his death, Andy was buried, an unusually fast timeline for someone of his fame. It was done privately, exactly as he had requested, without a public viewing and without fanfare. His burial reportedly took place on the grounds of his family estate in Manteo, North Carolina. There is no public gravesite. Fans cannot visit his resting place. The property remains private, closed to outsiders, reflecting Andy's desire to leave this world quietly, just as he had lived during his final years. It was a simple ending for a man whose face had once been everywhere. For Cindy, it marked the loss of a husband she had cared for through years of illness. For his surviving family, it meant saying goodbye to someone who had lived many lives in one lifetime. Musician, teacher, actor, husband, father, and cultural icon. And for Andy himself, it meant release from a body that had grown tired after decades of carrying both fame and grief. His death closed the final chapter of a story that began in poverty, rose to extraordinary success, and ended in quiet isolation by the sea. He had spent his career playing men who guided others through life with patience and wisdom. Yet his own journey was filled with broken relationships, health struggles, and heartbreaking loss. He had lost his first wife, watched his son battle addiction, buried that same son far too early, and then faced his own decline with dignity and silence. Andy Griffith gave the world comfort. But behind that familiar smile was a man who carried pain with him until the very end. And when he finally slipped away that July morning, he left behind more than television memories. He left behind a story of resilience, complicated love, and a life that was never as simple as it appeared on screen. What's your favorite memory of Andy Griffith? Drop your answers in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.